All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel, as I said, on gender and caste, which begins the afternoon. We'll go from 2:15 to 4. And I'll take this opportunity to introduce our speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll make their presentations. And then just say a couple of things about the broader questions that Dalit feminists and the kind of critiques about the relationship between gender and caste have thrown up, which makes it, I think, an especially powerful and important site for rethinking both the politics of caste today and also for thinking about the longer-term legacies of anti-caste thought. Our panelists today are Sudha Rani, who's Dean of Social Sciences and in the History Department at the B.R. Ambedkar Open University. Next will be Jebroja Singh, who teaches in the Women and Gender Studies Department at St. John Fisher College. And then we will have Smita Narula, who is Clinical Associate Professor of Law at New York University, in that order. And just as an introduction to some of the conversations that I hope will take place in this panel, and especially in conversation between the participants themselves, it seems to me that questions that have emerged or have been put on the table by Dalit feminists today have been particularly important, I think, in doing three particular things. One is that Dalit feminists who began to organize in the mid to late 1990s put forward a particularly important critique, on the one hand, of the forms of caste patriarchy that they themselves experienced within both within the Dalit movement and within the context of their own family and intimate relationships. At the same time, they proposed and made very strong critiques about the history of Indian feminism as it had constructed itself and launched a sort of critique, an extensive critique, of the kinds of fundamental categories that Indian feminists presupposed in their own assumptions that women's experiences, their social experiences, and their forms of politicization and activism were somehow similar and or shared across the nation. In Dalit feminists specifically drew on longer-term traditions of anti-caste thought, drawing on people like Phule, on Periyar, on Ambedkar, and on people like Tarabai Shinde in Maharashtra, who had been one of the first in 1882 to propose a very strong critique both of caste patriarchy on the one hand and then more broadly of colonialism and Brahmanism. And so, and one of the important arguments that has been put forward by Dalit feminists, and I think something that all of our panelists will be addressing today, is the relationship between the social reproduction of caste on the one hand and its sexual reproduction. And so the relationship between the sexual and the social reproduction of caste, I think, is something very important. The second, and something that Smita will speak to today specifically, are the new traditions of feminist activism that Dalit feminists specifically have made use of. And this, I think, really has to do with drawing on the testimonial, going before international bodies, especially the UN, but more broadly making use of a kind of human rights discourse, in a sense, to short-circuit the kind of predilections and the foreclosures of the Indian nation state and actually addressing their critiques. So with that in mind, let me ask Professor Sudha Rani to begin the conversation today.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy. I feel it my privilege to be here in this August abode of learning, Columbia University, which was been a dream to me to study here, but a dream come in a different way, to be with you, share my thoughts with you. And why I'm using this word dream? It's a dream for the Dalits, Dalit women especially, who is born in a poor family, being born to a labor in a coal mines, who could not afford education to his children, 8 children. I'm being the youngest of them. And it's a dream for anybody like me to educate in higher education institutions, but I could make it because of the affirmative policy of Indian government, envisaged by the father of the Constitution, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, morning I was referring to Pratapji about the reservation policy. He says that it is important to the lives of thousands and millions of Dalits in India, in South Asia, to better their lives and to be on par with other individuals. And today, I'm going to talk about Dalit and people's movements in Andhra Pradesh, Dalit women perspective. This, thanks Anupama for giving a tone to the panel. And exactly some of the points which I raised as a part of my presentation may answer them. I'm going to talk about the Dalit women perspectives, contextualizing in the region which I come from, Andhra Pradesh, talking about some of the atrocities done on the Dalits and how the atrocities or the violence acts on women, how the women really, who is the lowest of the society, how it adds to the misery of her life and how she feels it and how she fights about it and how she comes out of it and how she organizes herself into be a more struggles, maybe leading the struggles. This is how my presentation goes on. In South Asia, they have Dalits have endured discrimination based on work, descent for centuries, and the discrimination continues even till today. Caste system declares Dalit women to be intrinsically impure and untouchable, being located at the lowest rung of the society. And morning we are talking about the landlessness. The landlessness of the Dalits and the landless laborers, the laborers who are agricultural laborers working in the fields of the landed classes, engage themselves as daily wage laborers. As women also, they have been subjects of discrimination. We have been talking about triple discrimination, as women, as poor, and as Dalit women. So these three discriminations she is subjected to. I just want to put exactly the situation of a Dalit woman in the words of a Dalit feminist writer, Chalapalli Swaruparani. And this explains everything, how a Dalit woman is leading her life. She says in a poem, caught in the brambles, I'm a struggling palapita bluebird. Whichever way I move, all the thorns prick me alone. These are not the thorns of today. They are the shackles of slavery, placed around me from generations between the devil and the deep sea. Danger always hissed at me. And it goes on. And she says that if male arrogance at home gives me resounding slap on my cheek, one cheek, the caste dominance outside thrashes my other cheek. When I went to the fields to earn money by labor, when the landlord there lay in the way to rob me, my sweat, and me as well, and I wanted to bury myself in the earth. And she goes on saying that I will purge my life from this, in these flames of trouble and blossom like the monk in a flower. I'll cross the forest of hardship and surge like a stream. This explains precisely how a Dalit woman is feeling today. She don't want to be a silent victim of the atrocities, violence. She just want to come out of it and live an individual life. And coming to the topic again, the major problem Dalit women face today is impunity. So while the administrative system fails to implement laws, the perpetrators, the dominant caste, enjoy immunity from the prosecution for violence and subsequently use their political, social, and economic power to silence the victims. Now we are talking about the second part. Anupama says that how Dalit women look towards the mainstream feminist women's movement, because the mainstream feminist women's movement started in the 1970s precisely, and it addressed several issues such as equality, patriarchy, and equal wages, and lot many. But in Andhra, it started in 1973 with starting of some of the organization, Progressive Organization of Women, and the Organization of Protection of Democratic Rights, and Sri Shakti Sangatana. all the organizations, they do talk about women's equality, but Dalit women is missing in their discourses. And the issues of Dalits never figured in their movement, nor even in the history, in their struggles, rather. And they have produced a plethora of literature, which goes on for I think a decade, more than a decade. The famous being, most of you are familiar, We Are Making History, the anthology of 40 women fighting for the land and for their livelihood under the Communist Party banner. But in that anthology, not even a single Dalit woman voice is heard. Not even a single Dalit woman. They were in the forefront of the struggle. They were in the forefront of the struggle against the Deshmukhs, Deshpandes, landlords, putting their life at stake, subjected to rape and whatnot. But their contribution has never been recorded till today. Coming to the next part, atrocities, which I'm going to talk about two cases in Andhra. Morning, Anandji was talking about Sundur atrocity. And prior to that, there is one more incident happened in 1985, that is Karamchedu. Historically, whenever Dalits, both individually as a group, they are the target for non-Dalit aggression. The dominant upper caste as landowners and employers of labor exert considerable power on Dalits. Dalits, who are primarily agricultural laborers, work in their fields, are subjected to the violence. And morning Shivagam is talking about the dependency is more vulnerable situation. The social and economic vulnerability of Dalits provides readily available ground to the upper caste, to landlords, to demonstrate and exercise power. Given the power-struck hegemonic relations, whenever Dalits articulated their demands for higher wages and for increase of wages or for land distribution, they are subjected to social boycott or denied access to village natural economic resources or the atrocities. And this is, in the forms of assertion, Dalits due to education and employment also triggers intolerance. They could not tolerate the assertion of the Dalits. And coming to Karamchedu, this is an incident happened on July 17, 1985. Kammas, they are the landed classes, they are Shudra caste basically, but because of their land power, they rose to the prominence and they were in the government, powerful lobby in the government. They attacked the Madigas of Karamchedu. The Madigas are one of the subcaste in Andhra, major subcaste group, larger population. Official sources quote that, but unofficially it is much more, but the number given by the official sources, 5 Dalit men were killed, 3 women were raped by the Kammas, several men and women were injured. The post-atrocity struggle was continued from Chirala. I'm not going to talk about the depiction. The reason for this atrocity is simple. A Dalit women questioning the Kamma boy who is pouring the dirty water used for the washing buffalo into the drinking tank of Dalits. She questions that Kamma boy, why you are dirtying the water which is meant for our drinking purpose. This angered the Kamma boy, and he could not tolerate questioning of a Dalit woman. They could not tolerate the questioning of Dalits, and the women is considered still lower in the caste ladder. So that angered him, went back to his village, and again he talked to his fellow man. They came in with arsons and all, they summoned him, her and her father-in-law. They could not turn up because it was late. The very next day, they came to the village and killed men, Dalit men, and raped Dalit women and created such atrocity. Due to because of this atrocity, the Dalits fled to the next village, Chirala, where they lived in a Sibiram. And then they formed one of the Andhra Pradesh Dalit Mahasabha was formed. From the Carnage massacre, they rose to the prominence of organizing themselves and fighting for their cause. And they could not get justice, and it was delayed for so long, 20 long years it took, but punishing very few people. These are some of the pictures of Karam Chedu victims, where the women, they were beaten badly, and some of the women who are raped, admitted in the hospital. These are the pictures taken from the newspaper clippings. What is more important here is that the atrocities being covered by all the major movements. They have written about some of the articles have written about how Dalits were being while the violence is put on them, but the Dalit women voices were not heard. They questioned the chief minister himself. The Dalit women questioned the authorities, state authorities, and they say that we don't have any security in our own land. So what is the security for our future generation? This is a question put forth by them. And next, some more pictures of Karam Chedu. I'll move on to Sindoor massacre, another massacre atrocity, where again the Dalits were beaten and 22 Dalits were killed. Just, it was again the assertion of the Dalits, educated Dalits, which was not digested by the dominant caste people, the Reddys. Here, they are also landlords. Official sources say 8, but the unofficially, the 22 persons were missing in Sindoor massacre. I'll move on to the pictures where, the women, the victims, questioning the state authorities again. They want justice, not welfare. Dalit women questions that self-respect is more important than material benefits. Then moving towards Dalit women leadership. I'm sorry, I'm unable to explain how Dalit women could take that atrocity, but coming to the positive aspect of Dalit women assertion, I'm going to talk about 2 instances where, anti-Iraq agitation and another is a land struggle. This anti-Iraq agitation, the impact I'm going to just, during 1990s, the Dalit women took themselves the curtilage of this leadership in this people's movement, fought against the state, and were instrumental in bringing down the government. This became one of the election agenda. This is different from the Brahmanical agenda of, keeping away from liquor is as an ethical point. This is not the case with Dalit women. They want their men to be away from liquor because it is a livelihood issue. Because the government initiated Varunavahini, selling of the liquor and giving the liquor pockets in place of wages. This is one of the issues which Dalit women got affected, their livelihood got affected. The poor women were the worst victims, and then they took they fought against the state government, against Iraq. This is one of the biggest movement ever taken by women, especially the Dalit women. These are some of the cases, some of the photos where the women fighting against the state, and some photos where, people were died. This is the most important struggle which I'll explain in a minute. Madhur is struggle by Dalit women where, they fought against the land. They wanted to cultivate the government as in land, and then, but Reddys opposed this, the dominant caste opposed it, but they fought against it and they won the struggle. I'm sorry, I can't explain it much because the clippings are there. What are the demands they put? Immediate arrest of these landlords, and because the landlords, they, again, the struggle is based on land issue, and for the first time, gender issue is linked. This is what I want to focus on. There are several land, communists have taken the land issue, distribution of land to the Dalits, but never been in the history that gender is linked to the land issue. And Madhu's struggle showed the way to the communist struggle also, by linking the gender issue also. How important is the land for Dalit women? So they demanded the land entitlements on their name, not in the name of their husbands, but on their name. This is precisely what I want to talk about. This is some of the photos of their struggle. Coming to the last part, the Polapalli Dalit victims. Again, morning I was talking about that why women. So in conclusion, I'll just take a minute. What it means, look, why I'm showing these 4 different struggles is that 3 important issues that Dalit women put forth in front of the women's movement and in front of the Dalit movement. One is that Dalit women are being used as an object of sex and violence. It is significant to note that modesty of Dalit women is outraged and being justified as simple and insignificant issue. Never been the modesty of Dalit women is discussed and in a big agenda, or never been, it is looked upon as a simple matter that a woman is raped every day. Smita Narula's recent findings is that daily Dalit woman is being raped, but it's only a news for everybody, but not an issue to be taken seriously. The issue of modesty of Dalit women was never considered for debate. Paradoxically, modesty of upper caste women is considered high. Chundur, I forgot to tell you that why Chundur was taken so serious turn, because the Dalit boy, they say that, the Dalit boy teased the dominant caste women. This is precisely the reason for the atrocity. They say that a boy teased the upper caste women, which was not supposed to do that. And they say that, this is how the Babasaheb Ambedkar says that the dominant caste women's sexuality is being closely guarded. And he gave a statement that, women are the gateways of caste system. By saying so, he says that women's sexuality is being closely guarded by opposing the endogamy. Okay, sorry. Dominant caste women are reported to have marched in street declaring their modesty have been outraged at Chundur incident. And this has been brought out by Uma Chakravarti in her book. In conclusion, there is a significant shift from being vulnerable silent group to a group attempting to make a consolidated organized articulation by the Dalit women in Andhra. Dalit women question patriarchal mindset of Dalit men for not adequately spacing their modesty in the struggle. And Dalit women also articulations are carried out with reference to family, society and state, whereas dominant caste women largely talked about in the family. And Dalit women leadership is not adequate, found adequate space in Dalit movements, which we can see in Chundur, Karanchedu. Several women were in forefront fighting for justice with the government directly, Alisama and all, but never they were in the forefront as leaders of the movement. And now to conclude this thing, I measured the progress of women, Babasaheb Ambedkar's word. I measured the progress achieved by the women, progress of any community with the progress achieved by the women. Especially he addresses in 1942, Dalit Mahila Federation, he says that any progress of the community can be measured by the progress made by the Dalit women. Thank you very much for your patience hearing. And sorry if I'm missing any links. I can't help it because of time constraint. Thank you.
I apologize for having to cut people off or forcing them to shorten their points, but I think many of these issues will come up in the context of our conversation, and so I hope so that we'll be able to open up some of these issues she's brought up in the context of our collective conversation. I think Roja is going to speak next.
Thank you once again to the organizers of this conference and my favorite Baya Joel Lee for his invitation. My presentation is going to be on a Dalit woman writer. Critical Constructive Narratives by Bama, interweaving a liberation of visible bodies and silenced voices as texture for Dalit women's freedom. I start with a quote from this Dalit woman writer called Bama. We believed what they told us repeatedly, that we are useless chicken, scratching about in the rubbish, and now we have no confidence in ourselves. At least from now on, we must stand for ourselves. If ever there is a problem or a disturbance, everyone, starting with the police, chooses to blame and humiliate the women of our community. The government does not seem to be prepared to address any of this, so we must take up the challenge ourselves. End quote. I discuss Bama, a Dalit woman writer born in 1958 who writes in Dalit Tamil literature, as a testimonial voice of Dalit women's struggle for a personal sense of identity and a collective claim for human dignity. Bama published Karuku in 1992 that speaks of the experiences of Christianity as was nominated for her through Catholicism. She exposes ways in which both Hinduism and Christianity controls their lives as Dalits. She describes her experiences as a Catholic nun and the prevalence of caste in the nunnery that angered her so much that she just had to leave. In Sangati, published in 1996, Bama illustrates the everyday lives and struggles of Dalit women in her village of Pudupatti in Tamil Nadu. And what validates Bama's written narratives is the fact that they consciously transform a simple narration of a life story into a construction of the history of a people. In my larger paper, I interweave two forms of her narratives, her written texts and her oral narratives through personal interviews. For the purpose of this brief presentation, however, I dwell on her narrative Sangati, which literally means news or events. Bama's writings are testimonial narratives that interweave the visibility of women's bodies and silencing of women's voices in their struggle for identity and dignity. In Sangati, Bama lays out a social and cultural map of the Parayas of Pudupatti. She brings to focus the exploitation of Dalit women by the upper caste masters as well as the faithful Dalit male servants of the landlords who replicate their masters' violent authority on their women. Thus, Dalit women become the doubly oppressed or the subgendered being, if you will. And Bama, however, also galvanizes Dalit women as socio-political actors in their demand for justice and in their expression of resistance. I will focus on two mechanisms that Bama employs to convey the forceful purpose of her narratives: her presentation of Dalit women's bodies and their voices. Bama creates a persuasive methodological process that interweaves non-dominant voices and discourses. Voices of Dalit men and women, voices of young, resistant Dalit girls and the older, experienced, resilient voices of women, voices of Dalit cultural strengths revealed in songs and rituals, narratives emerging from forced silences and coerced internalization, the intermixing of the voices of Dalit Hinduism and Christianity as both oppressive and liberating, and the voice of alternative teachings of a liberating Christianity as opposed to the misappropriation of such teachings by oppressive sectors in Christianity. Such interweaving of voices renders Bama's narratives as stories that are credible, durable, and rich in their lending of layers of variations of the complexities of the lives of Dalit women. In her interview, Bama was insistent that Dalit women are not silent women, but have always been speaking in their cultural languages, that they tell and retell their stories in songs, folk tales, dances, and laments. But they are silenced voices, rather, who continue with their discourses of resistance to only those who will hear due to their fear of authority. Among the various voices we hear in Bama's Sangati, her grandmother, or Pati, which is the Tamil word for grandmother, is the most significant voice. She is the voice of tradition, the authoritative questioning voice from the margins, who has unwarily internalized the caste reality. In the argumentative voices of both Bama and her grandmother, we see how these textures present her community to a larger world, interwoven with all its vulnerabilities and resistance, strengths and weaknesses, determination and dilemmas. The party represents the unadulterated indigenous strategies of survival, but still within the cultural specifications that inform her consciousness of a life controlled by social hierarchy. And within that, she learns that she has to continue to speak and be heard by other Dalit women to create and share in a discourse of survival. For Bama, these are enduring cultural elements that need to be recognized and claimed by Dalit women for a transformative change. I use the word visibility in reference to Dalit women's bodies to qualify the corollary of their state of invisibility tucked away in invisible spaces. In addition to notions that Bama exposes the invisibility of Dalit women, I argue and add that Bama also chooses to highlight the visibility of Dalit women's bodies, and I attempt to extract the layers of meanings as I describe these bodies detailed in Bama's narratives. First of all, Bama's idea of visibility is a celebration of Dalit female body and sexuality, as she meticulously details for the reader Dalit cultural practices and rituals, and in that, her body is a positive cultural construct, where they are visible markers of subversive discourses that reject dominant traditional images of their bodies as polluted, immoral, and dispensable. Secondly, Bama details ways in which Dalit women are objects of selective visibility, subject to even selective touchability, as targets for sexual pleasure and attack for the oppressive powers that surround them. Their visibility is in relation to their immediate surroundings, and I do not, however, undermine their state of invisibility to the rest of the world. Bama also simultaneously both reveals as well as tills new grounds where Dalit female identity can and will thrive through active resistance to sanctioned imposed identities versus just an irksome coping. In Sangati, Bama interweaves such notions of Dalit female body and voice in the story of a young Dalit girl called Mariamma, who's her cousin, who's 15 years old. Mariamma, after a long day's work in the fields, returns home one evening, passing by a water pump shed in the fields. And her landlord, who happens to be in the watershed, tries to lure her into the shed. Somehow, Mariamma escapes and runs into her village and tells about the incident to her close friends. They advise her to remain silent because this would demoralize her since she was young and of marriageable age. And these girls are just about 13 to 16 years of age. For young Dalit girls, silence becomes their only protection from further harm. Their silence is a discourse in itself, a testimony to the knowledge of caste, patriarchal power, and their helplessness. The event takes a twist, however, when a landlord, fearing blemish to his name, reports to the village headman, a Dalit, that young Dalit girls who pass his fields often misbehave. He alleges that he saw Mariamma physically intimate with a young lad, Manikam. Both of them are made to appear before the village council made up of Dalit men for a trial, but it is Mariamma who is publicly humiliated and blamed of misconduct. She is asked to beg forgiveness by falling at the headman's feet and pay a fine of 200 rupees. At the trial, the visibility and loud authority of the upper caste landlord, despite the fact that he is not even physically present at the trial, is a stark reality. Mariamma, however, tries to speak for herself. As she is questioned, she concedes, "What that Machan says is true. When I was gathering firewood with a few others, he said a word or two to me in fun. I came away before the others left." Bama writes, I quote, "If Mariamma had said any more, she would have burst into tears. She finished speaking, wiped her face with her sari, and stood there, her head drooping." End quote. Unconvinced, the council insists that she fall at the feet of the headman and beg forgiveness and pay the fine. If she did not comply, her father would have to pay a lot more money as penalty. As her father forces her to beg forgiveness, she maintains her innocence, saying, "I never did any of that. It was the Mudalali who tried to misbehave with me. But I escaped from him and ran away." She began to weep loudly. Mariamma speaks to defend her honor and dignity, but the highlighted inscription on her body of blame, shame, and humiliation spoke louder than her actual attempts to speak, throwing her into a state of silent visibility, but her submissive body carries a powerful message to the rest of the community. Her body is used to both blame the victim and to redeem the village of Pudupatti through forceful acceptance of that blame. She is aware of the situation, tries to speak the truth, but speak is not edifying. Instead, it is defeated as a self-justifying ploy. Now, this incident leads us beyond dual conclusions into a reading of multiple meanings. As Mariamma falls at the feet of the headman, she literally carries the signs of patriarchal culture on her back, as she bends, breaks, and finally even falls, prostrating herself to perform her religiously and culturally sanctioned original natural definition of being polluted and immoral. While this drama of blame unfolds, the landlord is in his house, sheltered in the paraphernalia of caste, patriarchy, et al. The landlord reestablishes the pattern of this visibility of defeat and the hypervisibility of a sovereignty. And it is this culture of defeat and shame that Mariamma embodies. She is surrounded by the emasculated masculinity of Dalit men who make up for it in accusing her due to fear of losing their ties with the landlord, but at the same time she is surrounded by the physical presence and rebellious voices of Dalit women that they dare not raise among men. But they provide the moral affirmation that she needs at that time. When Dalit women do speak, their voice is invalidated. One woman, Anandama, says, "It was the Mudalali who tried to rape her. She was scared out of her wits, refused him, and ran away. And now he's turned everything around and told a different tale. I actually went with her that evening." Susayama says, "What can you say to these men? There is no way of convincing them, but it's only to us that they'll brag. Ask them to stand up to their Mudalali, they'll cover their mouths and their backsides and they'll run." End quote. They do not accuse the men openly, but only in muffled whispers, as Bama recalls. So Mariamma must accept this accusation so that the colony may be spared the threats of violence if they were to let her go unreprimanded. One Dalit woman says, "And none of them has the brains to find out whether it wasn't the Mudalali who was doing wrong in the first place." Another one says, "Who do you think is going to win, even if the Mudalali was really at fault?" So it is Mariamma who stands stigmatized, humiliated, and morally mutilated as yet another immoral Dalit woman. As we know, this practice of displaying Dalit women's bodies or parading them naked is quite common in rural India. Every time this happens, caste-based patriarchal systems of authority is reinvoked. All authoritative and powerful structures converge on her body. Therefore, as texts, bodies of Dalit women are sites of power struggles, sites of traditional and emerging caste ruling orders, and sites of cultural demarcation. Hence, in the very process where Dalit women's bodies are made sites of violence, a deep sense of collectivity of voices, though silenced, proves to be the strength that subverts the dominant notion that their bodies can be formulated as texts of violence to make a statement to the community. Therefore, their bodies morph into billboards that carry a terrifying message to warn their larger community, as a public statement is made in punishing her body and making it public spectacle. Therefore, remaining within one's defined space is crucial to prove one's obedience to a set of rules. When women cross over their gendered spaces as active agents in claiming their rights or dignity, it is unacceptable. So it is the meanings of boundaries and markers that one wrestles with in such situations where interactions between communities are solely based on power equations. The undercurrent that actually informs these interactions is complex, but nevertheless, the consequences of non-compliance to boundaries are straightforward. The interplay of women's social identities between visible, invisible, touchable, untouchable, laborer, sex provider, labor, bondage, dispensable, indispensable, reveal ambiguities that not only affect, but that allow for the creation of new categories of difference, is mainly for women, and Dalit women's bodies are configured as autonomous spaces to inscribe conflicting meanings to suit the needs of the dominant male. So in the culture that Bama seeks to reiterate, cultural strengths drawn from the community's beliefs and practices testify to a personal sense of identity that resists dominant culture. Bama seeks to tap into the cultural strengths that the grandmother and other Dalit women embody through emerging from the experiences of being silenced and victimized. So Dalit women's self-consciousness must be inverted by reversing mechanisms and strategies of social and religious constructions that keep them at the bottom. Creative explorations reanimate the silences and recover their bodies through existent cultural strengths, pointing us to more equitable and life-affirming possibilities.
Our final speaker is Smita Narula.
Thank you. I apologize that I was a little bit late. Janki said she came from a military family, so was always on time. I came from a UN family, so we do things at our own pace. But I apologize for holding you up. I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers, and just to reiterate what other panelists have said, this is truly a historic event to be here today, to honor Dr. Ambedkar, to do so at Columbia University, and for me just to be in the company of so many thinkers and activists from whom I've learned so much over the years. So thank you, and thank you, Joel, for inviting me in particular. Last week, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillai, issued a groundbreaking statement called Tearing Down the Wall of Caste, in which she called on the international community to come together to support efforts to tear down caste discrimination, as it did when it helped put an end to apartheid. The statement was a monumental one because it was the first time that a person in her position, which is the highest UN-related human rights position, came out and made such a comprehensive call for all caste-affected countries to take on the task of implementing human rights for the protection of Dalits, but also for the international community to come together in service of that project. It was also contained within that statement was a not-so-veiled reference to India's attitude this entire time by saying that the nature of the atrocities against the millions of individuals that she was referring to cannot simply be swept under the rug as family business, which has essentially been India's take on the international stage. This is a family affair. Please do not intervene in our personal situations. And by the way, we have a very progressive constitution and reservations, and therefore the problem has self-corrected itself. That moment had many markers preceding it, and the Dalit women's rights movement has played a significant role in all the markers before coming to that moment. Of course, there was the formidable presence of Dalit women's rights activists at the Beijing World Conference. There was the work of the Ambedkar Center for Justice and Peace in bringing these issues before the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 1996, and the first time that a UN committee was forced to articulate how all these bodies of international human rights law applied to this population of 260 million people in South Asia, even though the term caste does not appear once in a single international human rights document. Other markers along the way have been the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, in Durban, where the Dalit movement really came on the international stage and set itself up as one of the premier human rights challenges in which the international community must play a role. And since then, there have been many individual markers along information presented to different treaty bodies, the naming of special rapporteurs at the UN to specifically deal with work and descent-based discrimination, and the momentum has been building. Where did this momentum come from, and how have Dalit women played a role therein? So how we got to that point it's been, I think, a marriage between international and local actors, not just from India, but also from Nepal and Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, from Japan, from African countries, lest we not forget that caste is not just an India issue, but a subcontinental issue and even a broader continent and African issue as well. And it got to that point after many articulations by Dalit Women's Rights Group, who, stemming from the stage, and Sudha made a very compelling presentation of showing the ways in which Dalit women have always been at the forefront of struggles at the village level, at the community level, and also increasingly at the national level, heading national anti-untouchability campaigns, economic rights campaigns, the National Federation for Dalit Women being one prominent example of such campaigns, and that has now spilled over into the international arena. And just as Dalit women have had to contend with women's rights groups in India to find a space, they now also have to contend with Dalit rights groups to find a space for Dalit women's issues. And in bringing Dalit women leadership within Dalit rights group, bringing these issues on the international scene. There are two narratives that are very common to Dalit women's approach to bringing these issues into the international arena. And those narratives are descriptive, and they lead to a particular prescription, which I'll talk about in a moment. The descriptive part of it has to do, as I see it, has to do with showing the impunity for the acts of violence that have been so poignantly described in narrative form by Roja, and also in the form of movements and the slides that Sudha showed, that the impunity for those acts of violence has been the gap between constitutional vision and social reality in India. So all of these constitutions, all of the laws that exist and that hide the real face of democracy in India, that the huge gap between those laws and the reality of Dalits' lives and the impunity that marks is the narrative of Dalit women. And that has been part of the human rights conversation and part of the invitation of international human rights into Indian villages. The part of that narrative also includes statistics such as 13 Dalits are murdered every week, 5 homes are destroyed, 3 women are raped, 11 Dalits are assaulted, and a crime is committed every 18 minutes against Dalits. I'll come back to those statistics in a moment. The second part of that narrative is one of economic exploitation, and it's of showing the ways in which women form the majority of manual scavengers in the country. Manual scavenging as a caste-based occupation really reveals some of the issues of economic abuse and exploitation and the ways in which purity and pollution work into caste-based discrimination and occupation in a way that's very poignant and very telling for the caste system as a whole. It's also very telling that even as India continues to grow, even under global economic recession, and is sending spaceships into space and doing all the exploding nuclear weapons underground, that the number of manual scavengers simultaneously is increasing in the country. So you have to ask yourself, is this a problem of lack of technology or lack of resources or lack of sanitation? Or does manual scavenging exist as a practice because, and will it always exist because there will always be people to do that job? And there will always be a reason to keep them in those jobs because it satisfies a broader economic exploitation project. Those are some of the questions that Dalit women are bringing to the forefront of the conversation. The other part of that conversation is also the ways in which India's aggressive economic reforms, and indeed its entire socioeconomic development project, has largely either bypassed Dalits or has been servicing an elite dominant caste at the exploitation and at the expense of Dalits. And Dr. Taltunde has written a great deal about that as well. Then, if that's the description, then a few things that other sort of narratives that come into play. So there's the impunity conversation and there's the economic exploitation conversation. And underlying all of that is what I see as a message that needs to be drawn out, that when you talk about caste and gender in India, it is not just a conversation about women. It may seem that way because it's an all-women panel, but gender, as last I checked, also was about men. And it is also about the recognizing, and this goes to the statement of Ambedkar that Sudha just put up, that unless you deal with violence against women, which is where the heart of impunity lies, and the ways in which violence is meted out on their bodies and they become the battlegrounds, you will not deal with impunity and you will not deal with rule of law in India. Unless you deal with economic issues as they relate to women and land rights as they relate to women and labor as it relates to women, you will not deal with the caste-based occupation and the root of economic exploitation that is the caste system in India. So the issue of gender and caste is not a side issue that needs to be discussed as a special kind of victimization, even though it is a special kind of victimization. The narrative is really one of recognizing that until some of those issues are addressed at the state level, at the society level, but also in the home and the patriarchy within Dalit families and within the Dalit leadership level, then some of these broader issues are not going to get resolved. That, I think, has been one of the main contributions, and I just want to remind you of that narrative as we talk about gender and caste in this conference today. So what does it mean then to take that narrative and then to say, okay, international human rights law is now is it going to resolve and is it going to succeed where economic projects have failed and where constitutional projects have failed? And my answer to that question is no, but it can succeed. It's not going to succeed if it is confined to the moral and legal constraints of the regime in which human rights now lives, but it does have the potential for social transformation if we step outside the box when we talk about human rights. So let me start by the constraints. Human rights law and the idea of human rights is organized around this idea that the state has positive obligations to ensure non-discrimination and equality, that the state must intervene in the lives of its citizen, and by promulgating laws and enforcing those laws, that will trickle down to the rest of the population and equality will be guaranteed. How does that work in countries like India where the rule of caste sabotages the rule of law on a daily basis? human rights also assumes that the state is a neutral actor, and that the state, and this has already been said earlier today, that the state is a friend to Dalits, and the state will actually be coming in service of the equality project, without recognizing that the state itself is a replication of the very caste order and hierarchy that it itself has been charged with dismantling. That very challenge, and the fundamental challenge that human rights is the form of equality promoted by human rights, is in direct opposition to the form of graded inequality that the caste system represents, clashes on the Indian stage and in villages across the country to the detriment of security and citizenship rights for Dalits as a whole. Many people also talk about democracy. They talk about other ways in which India has progressed so much. And here, part of what the Dalit women's narrative has done is to really lay bare that India is a different country, and there are many different Indias depending on how it is lived by the communities that make up that fabric. It's a very different country for dominant caste than it is for Dalits. It's a different country for men than it is for women, for rich than it is for poor. And the ways in which Dalits are constantly pushed into a state of exception there means that they cannot access those particular rights that citizens and citizenship in a democracy can afford. I'll quickly come to sort of one of the, why I think even with all of those limitations, how I think human rights could possibly be a transformative project. But first to sort of explain where I think it has fallen down. It falls down by relying on the state to be a neutral actor, and by relying on the fact that just by saying that particular laws, once they've been put into place, will actually do the trick. It also falls down by not taking into account that the state is shrinking in some ways, in other ways it's growing, but what about the private sector? Where do human rights go when state obligations don't travel with privatization of certain services to the private sector? Feminists have long argued and have tried to bring human rights into the home, but again, it's much more difficult to have laws that govern those personal relationships and have a human rights conversation when it's really about family business or domestic affairs. So where does that leave us? And where does that leave somebody like me who's actually been doing human rights activism for a very long time? And where do I come out thinking about this? I come out thinking about it that it's that moving from description to prescription. It is essential that the international community stay involved. It is essential that that partnership raises the voices of those who are already doing this work and have been doing this work for centuries, actually, from within. But it's important not to set our sights on the bottom of the system. And here I wanted to quote Ambedkar in one passage that he said that always resonates with me, which was, "It is usual to hear all those who feel moved by the deplorable condition of the untouchables unburden themselves by uttering the cry, 'We must do something for the untouchables.' One seldom hears of any of the persons interested in the problem saying, 'Let us do something to change the touchable Hindu.'" And this quotes and this philosophy is familiar to many of you in the room. If I were to translate that and transpose it onto what human rights needs to do, what it says to me is that we shouldn't just be setting our sights on the victims and on protections for the victims. Where is the space of human rights about actually bringing the bigoted mindset into the room and treating as the problem the dominant caste and their casteist prejudice and their mindset? We often refer to Dalits as former untouchables. There is no former Brahmin legally or otherwise. We also talk about reservations as reserving in proportion to their population particular privileges or seats for Dalits and OBCs. What if we were just to reserve in proportion to their population seats for upper caste Hindus? Wouldn't that take care of the problem entirely? So I bring some of those out as examples of the way in which I think there needs to be a fundamental shift. And I think human rights, in cooperation with the struggles that have already been foregrounded by Dalit women and that have already had both the experience as those who receive caste atrocities, but also as those who keep their homes going and who keep the economies going. Ruth Manorama always talks about how India was built on the backs of Dalit women and in their labor. Taking those experiences and seeing how they have fought for those transformations and not just leaving the other part of the equation off. there is something between the state and between the victim, and that's much of society, which I think human rights has largely ignored. I'll end there and just ask us all to please bring that back in and to remember that gender and caste is not just part of the equation, it is the answer to the equation. Thank you.